all for being here. I'm Cindy Eisenhower. I'm from the Department of Anthropology and cooperating with the Climate Change Institute. And I'm very pleased to have you here and very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Daniel Murphy, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Cincinnati and also an integral member of the U.S. Forest Service's working group on community vulnerability and adaptive capacity. We'll be learning a lot more about that today. His research has really focused on two long-term projects. One is in Mongolia, where he has studied household vulnerability to environmental risks, so hazards, whether they be, what is it called? Or drought. And also, more recently, work in the U.S., rural U.S., highly vulnerable populations on climate adaptation planning, which you'll hear much more about. Dan's work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, EPSCoR program, the Winter Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the U.S. Forest Service. He's been widely published in Anthropological Quarterly, Regional Environmental Change, Economic Anthropology, the Journal of Peasant Studies, and American Ethnologist. So thank you for being here, Dan. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. And I'd like to also thank the Anthropology Department, the Climate Change Institute, the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, Ecology and Environmental Sciences, and the School of Forest Resources for helping to support Dan's visit. So thanks to everybody, and again, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. As you can see, there are more collaborators on this than just me. Okay, so I don't want to give you the impression that I'm Superman out there working with all these communities and fostering change all by myself. Okay. So what I'm presenting today is a collaboration, not just a collaboration with both social and natural scientists, but also with communities. And some of what I'll be presenting is produced through that kind of collaboration. And of course, there's a number of different organizations that are involved in this, from universities to the Forest Service to NCAR out in Boulder in Colorado. So the title of my talk is Climate Change Adaptation and Political Ecologies of the Future in the Rocky Mountains. And the key word here is future. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the future quite a bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's go to the Rocky Mountains, or as researchers in that area of the world like to call it, the Intermountain West. Okay, so we'll be a little bit more specific here. Okay, and climate change is already having a number of considerable impacts, and many of this you see every day on the news, right? So we got increase in fire frequency and intensity, prolonged drought. We have flooding. Flooding is a very big issue. Where I was working in Montana, it's a very, very big issue. And sort of insect with the pine bark beetle virtually destroying forests. I don't know if you've been out to, for example, Rocky Mountain National Park and seen it, and it is just, half the park is just dead, right? So these are huge changes that are going on, huge impacts. And clearly in such contexts, residents and others have to adapt to these changes, right? The Rockies are a pretty complex landscape. We have private and public land managers, lots of public land in these landscapes. Key industries that the rest of the country and other parts of the world depend on, such as ranching. And also key cultural resources, right? So we have Native American landscapes here. We also have a depth of history here, too. So these landscapes are more than just the resources that are on them, but also the meanings that we attach to them. And because of this, because of the complexity of such a landscape, there are a number of problems stemming from something like climate change, okay? And so elucidating the kinds of vulnerabilities and adaptations that might unfold over time is therefore key, right? As a stepping stone to fostering and facilitating adaptive processes and engaging citizens and all of these stakeholders in the kinds of response and action that are needed to confront it. So, if we go back, why political ecology? One of the goals of what I'm talking about today is really to talk about the place of theory, and in this context, social theory, in driving these kinds of processes, and how important social science and social theory are to formulating these kinds of activities when you're working with people. And so what we're going to see today is how that is driving this process, okay? And I hopefully that comes across. So what I'm going to do in this talk, first I'm going to describe three key adaptation problems that we really wanted to address in doing this. The second is to talk about how narrative-driven methodologies might help us address the kinds of problems I'll elucidate. And of course, explore the way theory-driven methods can employ narratives effectively in what we call multi-scale iterative scenario building, and I'll break that down later. And finally, what I'm going to do is analyze the data in ways that help illuminate why one would do a methodology like this. So how does that data that we generate, how does that connect back to our theory-driven methods? Okay, so making that full circle and sort of justifying why one would do things in these sorts of ways. All right. All right. And those are my two roads diverged in the yellow wood. Okay. All right. We're going to take the one less traveled by. All right. So, three key problems I'm going to talk about here, real briefly: uncertainty, the role of culture and meaning, and this key problem of transformation and what that means. We hear it a lot. And what does that actually mean? Okay, when we talk with communities. So uncertainties are the known unknowns in a sense, and sorry to quote Donald Rumsfeld. They reflect the inability to assign a probability to some occurrence. Okay, so in terms of climate change, this is a really key problem. Because our attempt to assign probabilities to future events or processes, whether they're climatic or they're economic or social, frequently overextends their utility and overstates their authoritativeness. So even with climate data, there's considerable uncertainty. One of the things that we came up against was precipitation. What is our precipitation data in terms of our scenarios? And these probabilities are also only provisional, right? So we're working in a different kind of space here. And one of the key problems too is the way that focusing on climate change can also lead to climate reductionism. Okay, and so there are uncertainties about overly focusing on a particular goal. All of that you've just left out. Okay, and so that's a big, wide space of uncertainty. In contemporary sort of focus on vulnerability and adaptation also tends to ignore the fact that human ecological relationships are fundamentally entangled and mediated by culture, which just simply makes this more complex, and by more complex becomes more uncertain, right? And so teasing these things apart, okay, in the context of climate change is very difficult to do, right? So that leads me to talking about culture and meaning. As Neil Adger has recently pointed out, climate change has failed to acquire any significance or meaning for the majority of us living in the Western world. That's a depressing assessment, but it's an honest one, right? And it's really, what he's focusing on here is the role of meaning. It has not acquired meaning for us, right? And that leads to this problem of culture. And what we've seen from the literature also is that misunderstandings around climate change have less to do with understanding the nature of climate and more of understanding the nature of reality and the role of knowledge in that particular space. So distinctions from ontologies to cosmologies to everyday knowledge requires that we must recognize that human worlds are symbolic worlds, okay? And this is the place for meaning. So change, whether it's climate change or any kind of change, is understood, interpreted, and enacted through architectures of symbolic meaning. And that meaning is diverse and reflects the complexities of place and difference. As Noel Castry has recently argued in Nature Climate Change, humans are diverse, interpretive creatures who frequently disagree about values, means, and ends. And as such, our response needs to combine scientific, interpretive, and critical knowledge in different ways that are reflective of life in a plural world. Okay? So here, we need to see a place for culture and meaning in this. And it leaves us with this final problem of transformation. As our archaeologist colleagues can attest, humans have dealt with transformations in the past, and we certainly will in the future. And we know that climate change poses, in socio-ecological terms, a transformational threat, right? A high-level, system-changing threat in that our ecological relationships might be disassembled and reassembled in new ways. But if meaning and knowledge are critical and transformation itself is an uncertain possibility, how is transformation given meaning? All right? And how might we reconceptualize and renew our relationships with each other and with the natural world? So given all these daunting problems and how they intersect with one another, how might we engage this issue of climate change, right? And what tools do we have that we can deploy in addressing them? So first, I would point out that we might need to reconceptualize things a little bit, okay, and get a little bit more comfortable in dealing with those spaces, right? And here, I draw on this idea of post-normal science, right? And so this little graph here sort of gives us a sense of where post-normal science can kind of fit into our toolkit, right, our toolbox, all right? So if we have high uncertainty, all right, and we're working in a condition where values are uncertain, and we're working in a condition of high stakes, okay, this is not a condition in which we can use science effectively, all right? We're working in a different space, okay? And this different space requires different kinds of tools, different ways of knowing, all right? And so this is what we would call post-normal science, okay? And this has been defined as where facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are uncertain, our decisions are urgent. We need to work in different ways that move beyond the best available science, okay? And here, what I'm trying to do is offer narrative as a way to do this, as a way to insert into this space. As Mike Holme points out, we need a bigger story about climate change than can be offered by science or art alone. And such a story can only be invented, and if it's invented, it must be enacted, okay? And in that sense, it's kind of a positive, okay? So working in the spaces can also be really fun and positive, okay? Because when nothing is sure, everything is possible, all right? So we can do a lot in these kinds of spaces, all right? And this idea of positivity and working in these spaces is also really important because that uncertainty surrounding transformational threats can be so paralyzing. And when people see this, they look away, right? So we need to create ways of engaging and speaking about these sorts of things that allow people to feel emboldened and empowered to act in the world, okay? All right, so narrative might be one way to do that, but let's be a little bit skeptical, all right? And so what I want to do is kind of go through why would we need this? What does it do, and how might it help? So a key problem that we're dealing with in climate change is that information packaging really isn't working. All right, if it's not acquiring meaning for us, that the way we're disseminating information about climate change isn't quite working, and it's only marginally helpful in encouraging and facilitating action. In critiques of what has been called the information deficit model of science, which focuses on provision and packaging, we see limited receptivity. All right, even as our climate models have become more refined. So even packaging models like local scale visualizations aren't really working in the way that we hope they would because they're often passive, right? And they lack this sort of visceral humanness that people aren't able to attach to and empathize with. Narrative, however, when combined or channeled, particularly through an interactive and participatory methodology, as I'm going to hopefully describe here, shift our focus from passive tables, passive data, passive charts, to what I call positive world making. In this kind of space, what we try to do is embrace a dynamic holism. Okay, so move away from that sort of climate reductionism. Okay, and see the world as it is. In this way, we can see a fuller picture. Right, we get a fuller story and a bigger picture of the world. It's important because there are multiple forces going on here. Societal dynamics, as drivers of change, always interact with and often outweigh climate change, right? So in this space, we can broaden our world and think about our world more holistically. Narratives are also really interesting because they can be comprised of multiple knowledges. And they can weave together diverse perspectives, or at least illuminate their incommensurabilities, all right? So we at least see where people are disagreeing when you try to weave these things together. So as Robinson and Westerhoff point out, a narrative understanding allows for the multiplicity of truth or accounts of reality, each with its own unique position in time and space, wrought from our interactions with each other and with the material world. So in this sense, narrative is open to meaning making and knitting together with relevant symbolic architectures that I was speaking about before. Narrative and story allow us to craft disparate events and ideas into an ordered whole that has its own unique teleology. So in this context, maintaining relevance, salience, and coherence also allows narrative to unveil and illuminate not just fears and emotional barriers, but also things like risk perceptions, diverse knowledges, and the fundamental values that underlie our actions. So let's say we're gonna do some narrative, okay? All right. So narrative is writing, right? And because it's writing, we need some rules to follow, grammars, if you will, okay? The narrative also needs some kind of genre that organizes how stories might unfold, all right? And here is this point where theory comes in. In other uses of such kinds of temporally sensitive methods, for example, trend analysis, simulations, or projections, such as agent-based modeling, we often see the application of game theory and rational choice theory, right? So there's theory driving those methods, right? Here in this context, what I turn to is political ecology, which is my background, and the social scientists I collaborate with is also their background. We also combine influences from anthropology and other social sciences to articulate how our characters and plots might unfold. Political ecology, in its most simple form, combines the concerns of human ecology with those of political economy. So focusing on the ways that culture and power mediate human-environmental relationships. So in this kind of space, we see our characters or our actors as agents. Okay, so they're capable of acting in the world, right? But they're also effective narrativizing subjects, working within symbolic structures and working through forms of power that both shape and give shape to actors. Okay, so meaning is important here. It's how people act. They act through meanings. So in this sense, we recognize the role of culture, how meaning, practice, and power articulate so that some stories might be told and others won't. All right, and so in this sense, we see how theory begins to sort of restrict where those stories might go. Right, and so we see how theory might affect how those stories might unfold and where they might end up. Okay. So finally, as we combine both the symbolic and the material, and the spatial and the temporal in this sense, narratives can be explored as stories lived in practice, linked to our lived experience as temporally bound, but also spatially enmeshed physical beings. Narrative then becomes a process rather than an event, and you'll see how process influences what we do. So, now yesterday I gave a very sort of what to do, what not to do lesson on scenarios. I've been involved in 4 different scenario projects, and if anything, this is the most important slide, okay? And I talked a lot about guiding principles and how getting on the same page and having a set of guiding principles is so important to making sure the process unfolds in the way that you want it to. So in addition to basic rules of writing, our style and genre, we also draw and incorporate some guiding principles for how we're going to convert narrative to a usable methodology, an applied methodology for exploring climate change adaptation and vulnerability. So first off, as we already know, we want this needs to embrace uncertainty, right? So it needs to have this future orientation. So not just risk and probabilities, but people must be able to engage with the known and the unknown, right? It must also be contextualized, all right? And so we use landscape here in 2 ways, all right? We use landscape both in its ecological sense and secondly in its cultural sense as a particular sense of place, right? And this creates a singular setting in which the narrative can unfold. So this is the stage we're setting. And so we also recognize that in both of these senses, we're not talking about closed systems, right? But rather open and various linked, nested, and articulated configurations of people and their environments across multiple scales, right? So we see how these particular places are also linked to federal agencies, to global markets, and these sorts of things, okay? And not just bounded in one particular place. And we also wanted to make sure that whatever we did, it was dynamic and emergent. So in this sense, what we want the process to be is multi-authored and diverse. And this creates the necessary back and forth or dialogics to foster mutually crafted narrative, all right? So you need some kind of back and forth, some sort of dialogue going on. Additionally, the narratives must be open to go where they will and create space for actors to make change. And in this, we're following what Castro is calling on many of us to do, which is to throw it wide open. So we want to throw open the possibilities and see where this will lead us. Okay. So here, what I'm trying to argue is why scenarios are a good fit to enacting these principles, to taking these sorts of ideas and putting them into an actual process. We could write in a lot of different ways, but in creating usable narratives that not only exemplify our guiding principles, but also illuminate these dynamics about climate change we want to know, we needed a process to facilitate this, and that's where we are with scenarios, which I'll just go ahead and define as qualitative descriptions of alternative sets of future conditions. Now, that's a very basic definition. Scenarios can go in a million different ways, which is the importance of having guiding principles and all of these sorts of things. Okay? So we explored a diversity of scenario approaches, from planning activities such as wargaming to community visioning, scenario tools from agent-based models to landscape visualization, and various kinds of future studies. This is a wide open field. There's a lot of people working in this kind of stuff, and they cross all kinds of disciplines and all kinds of problems. So what are they good for? Scenarios are useful in addressing conditions of moderate to high complexity and moderate to high uncertainty. So clearly here climate change fits the bill. And in fact, there is considerable use of scenarios across the climate change literature, even beyond those that are done with, for example, the IPCC, which is the most well known. Yet it's important to keep in mind that scenarios do not solve problems in themselves. And how they are used and how scenario processes are crafted is really key to getting what you want out of the process. That's a little too far. Okay. So in this process, though, I don't want to give the impression that these narratives can just go where they will. Okay. We also bring in science, and the goal here is not to leave that out. So scenarios also open space to bring in probabilities, right? So we do know some things, and that's key for the kind of world making that this narrative approach needs. So as we'll see in just a minute, we've cobbled together various aspects of scenario building that fit our theoretical and practical needs in various ways. So in this sense, to wrap this sort of section up, what we arrive at is the kind of post-normal science necessary for both engaging questions of adaptation and vulnerability in the context of climate change, as well as engaging participants, stakeholders, etc., and facilitating the kind of dialogue necessary for fostering effective responses. At least that's what I think. That's what we think. Okay? All right, so this is the space where we began and what we developed, and this is what we've used in the Big Hole Valley, Montana, and I'll introduce these research sites in just a minute, and the Grand County, Grand County, Colorado. We've moved on from this particular practice model and have implemented this in a variety of different ways, different decision-making contexts. So this is really just one, but this is the original that we were working with, okay? So we have this landscape scale, and this is what we're thinking. We're looking at the diverse impacts that climate change might have across a particular kind of landscape, all right? And for those of you who were here yesterday, you've heard all this before, but maybe a good reminder, okay? So what we start off with are three different scenarios, and I'll go into those scenarios in just a little bit and what they actually say, all right? And we start off with three scenarios that were developed by our team of natural scientists. So we have climatologists, hydrologists, and ecologists. And these scenarios describe biophysical changes, okay? So they don't incorporate any kind of social, economic changes. Those are added in at later scales, okay? So we start off with these basic scenarios of biophysical change. And then we do individual interviews, and this is a little bit backwards. So typically scenarios work in focus groups or at a community scale. But what we did was work at this individual level, and this was for a lot of different reasons. So I talked about how political ecology has really influenced the methodology, and that some stories will be told and some won't be told. Well, it's really interesting to find out what responses will actually make it through this process, which responses won't make it through this process. And the best way to do that is to interview people individually. Okay? Interview them in a space where they feel comfortable saying anything they want to say. Okay? Because when you move up in scale into these groups, into community levels, these stories will start to fade away. Okay? And you'll start to see the politics kind of unfold. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Right? What groups dominate these landscapes and what groups don't? Right? All right. So we start with these individual interviews. We collect people's responses. What are the impacts? How might you respond? What would you do? Okay? And then we analyze them. We go back to our natural scientists and we say, okay, here are the responses. We prioritize them according to likelihood, and they assess what would the environmental impacts of those responses be. And what we do is we rewrite the scenario. The scenario gets longer, more complex, more actors. We've got social data in there now, economic data. Okay, we've got this kind of data in there now. At that stage, we go to focus groups, and we separate people out by different livelihood groups. So we have ranchers, for example, in the Big Hole. We have ranchers, tourist operators, we have outfitters, small business owners, and we set them out into focus groups. And we have them review the scenarios we've written. Once they review the scenarios we've written, they start strategizing within their group what sounds most likely, and we work through them again. And we go through the same process again, going back, analyzing, going to the natural scientists, and rewriting the scenarios. And finally ending with this community stage, where we start talking about adaptation strategies. What strategies might unfold in these contexts? What is important? What kinds of things are key in these contexts? Okay? And we wanted to go up to a much broader scale. We never got to that point. So this is a little bit of dreamland here. Although there's an ongoing project in southwest Colorado that is working at a very large scale. It's all of southwest Colorado, the Gunnison and San Juan valleys, and it's very huge. It didn't go through these initial processes. They started up here, and it's running into some. I described this yesterday. I'll leave the slideshow to Cindy so you can see all the problems that have been associated with that. So this process is really driven by some of our ideas, right, about narrative and about political ecology and who an actor is and those sorts of things. All right, so this is really sort of driven by these ideas. Okay, so the initial scenarios, and I'll just go over these real briefly. The initial scenarios were developed by a team of natural scientists, as I said, at the University of Montana, but also in collaboration with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and created scenarios of possible futures. They used a variety of data. They used historic information about the area, downscaled climate models, data on current trends and conditions, all specific to these particular landscapes, as well as just current scientific thinking about Western landscapes more broadly to produce the scenarios. The scenarios that we produce are 20 years out, and it's a somewhat arbitrary reason why we have chosen that, but partly because of the people that we want to work with. We needed to think about what time scale is important to them. And so we chose this temporal scale because it was within the reach of landowners and human communities in terms of their memory, okay, in terms of their planning and how they think about time. And also generationally, these people will still be around in 20 to 30 years. So this was a time scale that would work, that we could get effective responses for thinking about planning in this landscape. So we produced 3 qualitative scenarios to describe these possible futures using lay language as opposed to scientific jargon. And so these scenarios, although they describe biophysical changes, are very much written kind of like stories. Okay? They're cohesive narratives about biophysical change in that particular landscape. So they describe changes to forests, rangelands, and aquatic systems. And what we came up with were these 3. Some like it hot. They all have these catchy titles. I didn't come up with them, so don't blame me. The seasons they are a change and feast or famine. Now, what ended up really working with these is not only were they all within the realm of possibility in terms of what the models were showing, in terms of particularly temperature and precipitation, but they all pose particular adaptational problems. And we didn't actually set out in this particular context of thinking about that, but we noticed this at the end of the project. Okay? So Some Like It Hot describes widespread drought, warming winters, lower snowpack, earlier snow melt, longer summers, lower late summer stream flow, deeper drought, longer fire seasons, stressed fish. All right, but in a coherent, story format. Okay. And so essentially what this is describing is kind of a unidirectional change. All right? It's warming, less precipitation, drought becomes the new normal. Okay? And that's sort of the direction of this one. The seasons they are changing is interannual variability. All right? So we're seeing changes in the seasons. All right? Particularly spring and winter are changing in this scenario. And in feast or famine, we're seeing interannual variability. We're seeing changes between years. Okay, so some years you can be kind of cool. Next year it could be deep, deep drought. Okay, and each of these describes a certain series of impacts. For example, this has a very wet spring, and that wet spring leads to a very deep drought in the summer, which creates the conditions for very large fires. Okay, so this one in particular has this fire element. A feast or famine. What we had here were some big events like flash flooding ended up being quite common, okay, in this particular scenario. So we ran this process in 2 research sites that are ecologically similar, but though they share traits of many communities in the Rocky Mountains, they're actually quite a bit different. So Big Hole Valley, Montana is a ranching landscape. This valley has population roughly 300 people, very small, very large landscape, but very small population size, very large landowners. Interestingly, a lot of private landowners, okay, in the form of ranches. Not as much federal land in this landscape. Grand County, Colorado, much bigger, 14,000 people, big towns, big ski resorts. Winter Park is there. Right on the western side of Rocky Mountain National Park. So very different landscape. And yes, that is me fly fishing right there. And no, these sites weren't chosen, wink wink, because they have really good fly fishing. Okay. So overall, we conducted between 27 and 35 interviews, so 27 in the Big Hole, 35 in Grand County. Now these interviews also include focus groups. So the total participation is 80 between the 2 sites. Okay, so what kind of happened when we actually did this? Okay, and I'm gonna draw on the Big Hole a lot because I think the distinctions here are much more obvious with data from the Big Hole. So this thing we might call a system, all right, unfolded in radically different ways depending on the scenario we were showing. So if we went back to those scenarios, we've got that some like it hot, we've got the seasons that are changing, right? Each of those, over those iterations, unfolded in very radically different ways, okay? Which is interesting because when we started off the process, particularly the natural scientists thought the scenarios were too close, that they were too similar, that people wouldn't be able to distinguish them. Well, they distinguished them, and the results were quite dramatic. So scenario 1, that first scenario, effectively in the Big Hole leads to community collapse. People saw this is the end of our towns. Our towns no longer exist in this scenario. Okay. Now it took those iterations to get to that point. Okay. This wasn't just an immediate response. It took time to see what other people said. Okay, to get to that point. But no schools. People felt there goes our post office. Right. So all these things that we can kind of consider mundane things, they saw this as collapse. Okay, and the Big Hole, as they said, would no longer be the Big Hole in that scenario. Okay. Scenario 2, what we saw was some differences here. People saw that ranching would continue. It would be rougher, but ranching would continue. Tourism would go down dramatically because of the fires. The interesting thing was how county managers, the county government, and planning agencies, management agencies have a difficult time, and partly because of weeds. People saw that scenario as being particularly fruitful for weeds, increasing invasive weeds all over this particular landscape. And then you top that with fire, and suddenly their resources are really pinched. Okay, and that takes time to see what people would do. Are ranchers going to take care of their own weed problems? If not, that has a big implication for other land managers, right? Now, scenario 3 was a lot of disagreement. We had people all over the maps, right? This is that between-year variability. A lot of distinctions between different groups. Our agency, the participants who were from agencies, mostly would not even respond to this scenario. They had difficulty responding at all because they didn't want to say anything because, in their words, they needed better science. They couldn't do anything and present it to community members or to forest planners or in any kind of sense that this would be enacted. And so they would basically just a very general response of, you know, in this scenario, I need to see more science. This isn't enough for me, okay? So we saw distinctions there. We also saw some complex linkages come out right away. As one rancher with the Big Hole said, well, we're in an irrigated pasture situation. This is going to reduce the production quite a bit. Won't put us out of business, probably just reduce stocking rates and all the habitat stuff. Then you get the Arctic grayling starting to go down quickly, and that's a particular fish in the Big Hole River that's at threat of becoming listed on the endangered species, the threatened species. Grayling starting to go down quickly, and then they're going to make us start irrigating less. And we're already irrigating less because the flow regimes have changed. Immediately, in one response, that person has linked endangered species listing for the Arctic grayling to production, to management agencies. All of these things start coming out in a single response. And so these kinds of linkages that are sometimes difficult to tease apart were immediately emerged in this process. We also noticed the problem of place and the aesthetics of place played a big role in these particular relationships. So as one a rancher said, actually this was an angling outfitter, the bottom line is if we make it so tough for the ranchers to make a living and force them to sell out and it becomes developed through large real estate sales that subdivide into smaller plots is going to look like any other watershed in the state or in the country. So angling outfitters and ranchers tend not to get along, okay? Because when a rancher irrigates, he's keeping water out of the river, right? And that stresses the fish. That can close down the river, and an angling outfitter loses a day on the river to take people out, okay? And so in some ways they're kind of antagonistic. But in this case, the angling outfitter is saying, well, if we make it hard for that rancher, Big Hole becomes a very different landscape because he's going to sell out to some housing developer. He sells out to a housing developer, and no, wealthy stockbroker from New York City is going to want to come out here and spend $4,000 for me to take him out on the river, right? So these linkages and how they're inserted they intersect with aesthetics and these ideas of place, right? Emerge in these scenario building activities. Right? And we also get trajectories to some really surprising places that for everybody, the researchers and for everybody involved, were really interesting. So, and this is representative of where ranchers got with these scenarios. So the ranchers say, we have improved our grasslands, we have made the improvements to wildlife, we've made improvements for our cattle, and anytime we can improve and enhance our grasslands, it's helping us out. Anytime we can do that, we're killing 2 or 3 birds with one stone here. We're helping the public and tourism. We're all going to benefit. Whether the grayling is here or not, we will benefit. What he's talking about here are collaborative conservation efforts, and this is huge. So if climate change poses a threat to Arctic grayling and they're listed as an endangered species, most of the collaborative conservation efforts conservationists think that those will no longer function. They are scared that this will no longer function because ranchers will no longer want to be involved. What this rancher is saying is, no, we'll still be involved. We'll continue to collaborate with conservationists even if the Arctic grayling is no longer here because they see the benefits of conservation beyond the Arctic grayling. So this is very reassuring to management agencies, very reassuring to conservationists because they see themselves as somewhat antagonistic with ranchers. To find these synergies and opportunities through this building process is interesting, and it also reveals how these dynamics are really meaningful, right? So how people's attachment to place, attachment to these landscapes, are implicated in all the tensions and frictions and synergies that we're looking at. So one of the other things that came out through the process were different capacities to perceive risk and uncertainty. And really, some people, some were really capable of perceiving these changes in very, very, very different ways. And partly because of their place in the landscape, their history in the landscape, and how long they had been there. And so ranchers, for instance, tended to immediately transform that scenario into risk. They started referring back to all the strategies they've used in bad years in the past, right? Which you'd think is a natural reaction. We see small business owners, for example, not do that. Okay, most of them have just recently started businesses, and they would quickly think about how to get out. Right. So this sort of risk aversion, right, versus versus the ranchers. And just to give you a little local flavor for the Big Hole Valley, and excuse my language or excuse his language. This is how one rancher framed it. Ranchers are eternal optimists, and I can't do his accent, and we're as pessimist as we want to be. Well, I don't gamble? Bullshit. I don't gamble. We gamble every day. We're ranchers. We gamble every goddamn day. With Mother Nature, we gamble every day, and he is very excited at this point. What he's essentially saying is I can handle these changes. There's a point at which he cannot, but he can handle these sorts of shifts. He can handle these sorts of things in some kinds of ways. And he's counterposing himself to others who might not be able to stick it out in this landscape, right? So there's all these implications about identity and sense of self that also come into play here. We also see these multiple interacting sources of uncertainty come into play. Right? So participants, when they read these scenarios, they're reading biophysical changes, but immediately they're able to see beyond those biophysical changes, and mostly without prompting from us. They would consider the impacts, they consider their potential responses, but they immediately go on to economic uncertainties. They ask, well, what's the price of beef in Brazil? Right? So all their responses depend on all these things coming from different places. So what's happening down there versus what's happening up here? These things are going to make a big difference, and they wanted to know more. Interesting, in both locations, migration was a big concern. In the Big Hole, in-migration was a big concern. So people who want to build vacation homes in New Mexico and Colorado, well, those people are probably going to start making their way up to Montana, that was their logic there. In Grand County, Colorado, the problem was out-migration. That people were suddenly not going to want to live there because you don't have skiing, right? So you have lower snowpack and have these sorts of problems. All right. So, and one of the paradoxes was that as a researcher doing these things and building these scenarios, they seem more speculative, right? And as you build them out, they seem more uncertain rather than less. But for participants, it's the opposite. As they start to build up these worlds, they start to get more confident, and they respond more clearly, more coherently, and they're able to strategize. So it's this interesting paradox that ends up resulting, and as a researcher, sometimes it's hard to kind of continue in that process because you know that what it's founded on is this process. But it was interesting to see people, as they feel empowered to act, are able to kind of chart things out in this way. We also saw scale come up quite a bit, and various constraints and barriers. And one of the interesting things, and I'm not actually going to get to this, unfortunately, but one of the interesting things that come up was this sort of tyranny of small decisions, right? And so they make these little decisions, and they see, for example, I'm going to experiment with center pivot irrigation versus flood irrigation, right? And that's sort of, I'll just experiment with it, try it out. Then to see what actually happens over the iteration when that little thing suddenly becomes a much bigger thing. Okay, how does it affect state hydrology and how they're going to manage that versus other ranchers, smaller ranchers? How does it affect fish? How does it affect all these sorts of things, right? So these little decisions that don't seem so important end up spiraling out, and they get to see what the implications of those are. And I talked a lot about vision and temporal scales, but I'm not going to have time for that. But just to kind of come back to thinking about, okay, what we wanted to look at was vulnerabilities, and we wanted to look at adaptation, right? And so we thought about these in terms of thresholds and triggers, right? These points at which you get to where things start changing pretty radically, and what things actually trigger those changes, and those moments in time and space that occur. And if we go back to, for example, the example about the different kinds of odd alignments and synergies that can happen, right? So thresholds are not just about the bad things that can happen. They're also about the good things that could happen. And one of the things that we thought was most clearly spelled out was the continuing of conservation even after the listing of the Arctic grayling. So before we did the scenarios, this was seen as a trigger point for negative implications in the landscape. But we actually see that it goes away, right? It's not quite the trigger that people thought it was, okay? And so we see that that's not quite as big a deal, right? We also see different kinds of thresholds, right? And how these thresholds sort of emerge over this process. And the last thing I kind of want to get at is sort of thinking about adaptation and how scenarios can really facilitate thinking about adaptation. And particularly by iterating the scenarios like we did, okay? By making the process work over time, we can see how decisions open up space for new decisions, all right? How decisions narrow space for other kinds of decisions. So we often call this path dependency. Path dependency really, though, frames this as narrowing decisions. But we talk about envelopes, okay? And how one decision can create a whole new set and array of decisions that can be opportunities and not just negative consequences. So, and lastly is this point of transformation. And I talked about that first scenario in the big hole and that comment that people made in the community scale focus group, how, you know, in that scenario, the big hole is no longer the big hole. And that was a key moment for thinking about all the things that people had talked about in that particular scenario. And thinking about how transformations in this context have more to do than just the kinds of ecological relationships and the ecological functions of a particular landscape. And here, for them, that connection to place, that attachment to identity, all of these sorts of things, if those things are unraveled, those things are also transformations. So the scenario process gets us at all of these different ways of thinking about climate change vulnerability, climate change adaptation, okay? And so what we've done, both of those cases were done in spaces without decisions, okay? So these were not decision-making contexts, okay? We wanted to see how scenarios work and how they unfold. We're now involved in a slew of different activities trying to see how these actually work in decision-making contexts and how they change when suddenly there's something on the table, when there's something to be won from the process, okay? And we're seeing this unfold in some very different ways, some in good ways, some in very bad ways. So we'll see how these unfold. I'm involved with the Wayne National Forest right now, doing forest planning, climate change, bringing community climate change vulnerability into that. And there's a big project in southwest Colorado, as I talked about, that's trying to actually lead this to adaptation decision making. And so we'll see where it goes. So there we are. So thanks.
Have you noticed these differentiation vulnerabilities for certain segments of communities in these regions? I'm just thinking of indigenous peoples where I think in many cases, especially in Alaska, they're aware of the consequences of climate change. And I don't know, I guess I just see maybe differentiation occurring and maybe opportunities too, but
Yeah, so we go back to ideas about risk perception, right? And the ability to perceive just simply change. And so in the Big Hole Valley, for instance, the ranching community has most of them have inherited their ranches. Their families have been there since the late 19th century. So they're able to recognize change. Now, whether they see it as climate change is another question, but they recognize change and they can perceive the implications of doing certain things. They know how flood irrigation works in terms of the hydrology of the watershed. And they know that not because somebody told them, but because they've been living there and their families have been living there for a long time. You know, counterpose that to people who are angling outfitters who are an implant from, Chicago or California, and they're not as familiar, so they don't always understand the implications of a particular action, or able to see change in the way that the ranchers are. Now, the project in southwest Colorado nominally involves 2 Native American reservations, the Ute Mountain Ute and the Southern Ute. I'll be honest, they're not super involved. That process, as I talked about yesterday, is interesting for its problems. and that is one of its problems. And I actually went out and I met with the Ute Mountain Ute. They were very concerned that they weren't being included in the process, and totally get that and agree. And yes, I think they would bring a very different perspective to thinking about environmental change in these landscapes and how one should respond. But the other fields research sites don't involve Native communities. Although I will say, and this brings up an interesting thing I talked about yesterday, was in the Wayne National Forest in southeast Ohio, those communities don't even know there's a national forest. They think that those, that is a state park by the lake over there, and don't really know that that's in their landscape. So how do you work with people who don't even know the resources really there? And so we've developed ways to do that. But yeah, there are these differences that one has to be aware of in doing these sorts of activities.
Just a follow-up question to John's, I guess. I think the iterative portion of this is so interesting for precisely the reason that you said, that some of these stories often drop out when you get to a larger scale, and it tends to be those stories by the people who have less voice, right? Often, people who have been oppressed, people, whether they be Native or just other marginalized groups. And so I'm wondering if you did see, in the example of maybe Big Hole or in Grand County, if you saw that some of those stories, because of the iterative process you used, if you felt like this is speculative to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Do you feel like they got further than they might have, and do you feel like some of the other more powerful stakeholders recognized them or gave them any sort of validity? Maybe it's not an applicable question, but.
No, it's a very applicable question. I'm trying to come up with an example that would really demonstrate that. Yes, and I do recall the angling outfitters. There was one of them, I remember interviewing him and having this very engaged conversation about what should be done in terms of like river closures, and then you get them in front of other outfitters and the story can kind of change. And I'm trying to think if it was river closures or something else in particular, but the story can change. Their own story can change. But suddenly they're around other people and they better not say what they told me before. And ranchers that are really pro-conservation, that you're on the fringe. And though they may say that in individual interviews, they get into those focus groups and you start to see their tune change a little bit. So yeah, that does happen. I'm just trying to think of a particular example, but yeah, and I do recall that in the Colorado case, they were quite aware of that, and I wasn't the field researcher for the Colorado case, but the field researcher who was doing the interviews used some of those as prompts for questions in later interviews to bring those stories back up. Of course, not naming names, and to bring those stories back up, but yeah, that's something important to keep in mind.
So your work in Big Hole was in this context that you said like it wasn't a decision-making process, it was getting people talking.
Yeah.
Did you get some sort of sense that that group was kind of like taking ownership of maybe like a future decision-making process? Or like how much was this just foundation building that they were starting to talk, or did you like foresee it that moving forward?
It was interesting. So no, we did not attach this. We didn't want this attached to any kind of decision. We wanted to do this simply as sort of a social learning, sort of to reflexively engage these scenarios. And but so we got to the end, and all the tourism operators and small business owners have a little association, and they wanted to use the final scenarios to use for their planning for their association. I said, sure, go ahead, you can have them. And so yeah, so organically they kind of took it on their own. I don't know if they used it in any way, but it's interesting all the different ways. It's so small, the communities there, and they try anything to get people out there, including they have an open golf tournament. Golf TV comes now, and it's just open golf on ranch land, and so no fences, people are just out there golfing, and it's pretty interesting. And they have ski joring. Do you have ski joring here? where the horse pulls the skier, and dogs, yeah, dogs too, yeah.
And maybe I missed this, but how were the scenarios presented to people? Or was this something that people were reading, or was this like a verbal?
They were reading. The scenarios were about a page in length. They're double space, 14-point font. They are written like stories, so they logically flow. And I gave them highlighters so they could start working through it and highlighting what they saw as the most concerning things. And it helps them organize their thoughts and kind of to get going. Now, the project in Southwest Colorado that I said was interesting because of its problems. Their scenarios were 3 pages, single space, and that had a lot of problems. People couldn't digest that kind of information that rapidly. And even with the 1-pager, there were some elderly that we had to help them work them through it or read it to them because reading, their eyes weren't very good. So I mean, lots of different ways of doing it, but mostly through providing them the narrative.
I'm not really too familiar with the social science application here, but the federal government obviously uses structured decision making for a lot of their major decisions. Is this being integrated in that process?
Yeah, so the work I'm doing with the Wayne National Forest, they are going into their forest planning right now. And so what we've done, and this is partly in reaction to the Colorado project that did not go so very well, was they have a climate change scorecard. Okay, so we tailored it to work within that. They had an ongoing ecological vulnerability assessment that they were doing in concert with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And so we tailored it to work into their workbook procedures that they're using up there. So what we did was find a way to work within existing institutional pressures and institutional decision-making processes so that it actually produces something that's usable. So in that context, it's more of a guidance. The end product is more of a guidance document than it is anything else to help them. Now, the old sort of social and community vulnerability assessments that they used to do were simply how many unemployed, what's the incomes, and that's just not usable information. That just gets put on a shelf. So yeah. So we're trying to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah.